At every event that PEN Canada hosts, and at literary festivals across the country, we ask that a place be reserved for a writer who cannot be in attendance, who cannot do what Carol, Lawrence, and Randy are about to do, namely ask hard questions and strike notes of dissent that distinguish open societies from all others. We do this to remind audiences and remind ourselves that the freedoms we enjoy come with responsibilities, and to acknowledge the remarkable people who defend those freedoms, often at great cost. This evening, we are joined by Jose Armando Rodriguez Carradon, a veteran crime writer for El Diario newspaper in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. On the morning of November 13, 2008, Jose was shot at least 8 times by an unidentified person as he was about to drive his daughter to school. At the time of his murder, Jose was covering drug-related violence and organized crime in Ciudad Juarez. Shortly before he was murdered, he told the committee to protect journalists, quote, "The risks here are high and rising, and journalists are easy targets. But I can't live in my house like a prisoner. I refuse to live in fear." Despite repeated requests from hundreds of journalists and freedom of expression organizations like PEN, Rodriguez's murder remains unresolved and unsolved nearly 5 years later. If you'd like to support our efforts to ensure that the stalled investigation into his killing moves forward and that those responsible for his death are brought to justice, please sign the petition at our table at the end of this event. Finally, it is my very pleasant duty to introduce our moderator for this evening, who will in turn introduce our guests. Randy Boyagoda is the chair of the English department at Ryerson University and the author, most recently, of the novels Beggar Feast. He writes regularly for several prominent Canadian American publications, and he's a frequent contributor to CBC Radio. Randy is also the vice president of PEN Canada. Please join me in welcoming Randy Boyagoda, Carol Dawson, and Lawrence Hill to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Randy Boyagoda. I am the prominent moderator for this evening. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our dialogists. First, Carol Duncan. She's an associate professor and chair of religion and cultural studies at Wilfred Laurier University. She has a particular expertise in Caribbean religions in a transnational diasporic context. And she is the author of This Spot of Ground, Spiritual Baptists in Toronto. The final point, folks, that I will make about Carol is that she is an engaging academic. This is a contradiction in terms more often than not, but I think we'll all be enjoying her contributions tonight. Joining Carol on the stage is Lawrence Hill. He's written a novel called The Book of Negroes. Interesting. Has this come out recently? I've never heard of this book. I'm obviously joking, folks. Lawrence Hill, Larry Hill, is one of Canada's most prominent and indeed beloved writers, the author of many works of fiction and nonfiction. Most recently, he is the author of the work that provides us our occasion for this event tonight, which came by way of a response, a shocking response in many ways, to his acclaimed novel, The Book of Negroes. And the full title of your most recent work, Larry, is Dear Sir...
I intend to burn your book, An Anatomy of a Book Burning.
Thank you very much, which came out of a lecture you gave out in Alberta, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Under the auspices of the Canadian Literature...
The Canadian Literature Centre and the University of Alberta invited me to give their annual Kreisel lecture in April of 2012.
In April 2012.
Edmonton.
Now, the inspiration for that we'll get to in a moment, folks, but I wanted to give you a rough sense of how this evening is going to work. For the next 45 minutes or so, Larry and Carol are going to have a conversation about race and censorship, historical legacies, and the question of what it means to represent, to speak on behalf of someone else, and to reject that opportunity, that invitation to speak on behalf of someone else, or that effort. And by around 8 o'clock or so, we will then turn to questions from the audience. That will take us for about 15 minutes or so, and then there'll be some brief thank yous and goodbyes from Charlie, and we'll have an opportunity for book signing. Alas, my most recent novel is not here, But nevertheless, I'm sure that you'll find other things, the Book of Negroes apparently, and others that perhaps you would be interested in. But let's speak now most immediately about Larry's most recent work. This began with an email, Larry. Why don't you tell us about the email you received in June 2011 from a man named Roy in the Netherlands?
Roy Groenberg, yes. Well, I had just finished a book tour in the Netherlands, and it was for the literal translation from the Canadian title, the Book of Negroes. The title in the Netherlands, forgive my Dutch, which I don't speak, was Het Negerboek, which basically means the Book of Negroes in Dutch. And it went well. It was a good tour. People were very supportive and interested. The book was selling well. One of the audiences that I met with was a group of about 100 or 200 Dutch Surinamese who met me in their community center in Amsterdam. And we had a day, most of a day together, readings, lunch, conversations, a tour of the center, walking about. That went really well too. And I came home, and about a month later, I got this email that began, "Dear Sir, I intend to burn your book." And it was written by a man of Surinamese descent in the Netherlands who was livid that I had used the word Negro in the title of the Dutch edition, and he was therefore promising to burn the book in a park where there's a beautiful monument commemorating the abolition of slavery. And of course, the Dutch, like Canada and so many other countries, practiced slavery. It was abolished by the Netherlands in 1863, the same year as the Emancipation Proclamation. And he was just enraged that the word would appear in the title, so he was not so much threatening, but promising to burn the book, a month or so after the date of this email. So that was the first point of contact that we had. But I thought that maybe to begin the conversation and bring Carol right in, it might be interesting for us to share what significance the year 1973 had for both of us. And that might fit well into the rest of this conversation, as 1973 was a significant year in various personal respects for Carol and for me and my family that kind of dovetails with the story of the burning of the book and its title.
Well, 1973, 40 years ago, I came to Canada. I came to Canada on my mother's birthday, April 24th. And my brother and I, we arrived from Antigua, and this was our second migration. I was only 7 at the time. I was born in London, England. So 1973 for me, in many ways, is the beginning of new life in Canada. But it was also the year of OPEC, oil crisis, Bruce Lee, Enter the Dragon, Jesus Christ Superstar. So it was also the year of movies and popular culture for me, entering into that. I remember my mother would send my brother and I to watch movies, usually on Saturday afternoons, and the city was such at the time that you could send a 7 or 9-year-old to go and watch movies on a matinee by themselves, and it was all right to do so then. 1973 also signaled, in many ways, entry into the education system for me. And I haven't left. I mean, I'm still in the education system, this time as an educator. But it also seemed that there was a lot of bubbling in terms of the social fabric of the city. It seemed almost every week at school, and I went to school at Duncan B. Hood, at Dufferin and Eglinton, that there was a new child in class who had come from somewhere in the world. And if you were clever enough and were reading the newspapers as a young child or watching the news, sometimes there was a connection between where the kid was coming from and what you'd seen in the newscast. But I have to say, Larry, that I happened to see you within days of your receiving that email. You were in Waterloo, at the University of Waterloo, to receive an honorary doctorate, and I was invited to your reception. And I hadn't seen you for a little bit, and I came up to you and asked you how you were doing, and you said everything was fine, except that you were really angry that you'd received this email that was so incredibly confusing, and that somebody wanted to burn your book.
How did you respond first then, Larry, to that? Did you write him back, and what did he do?
Well, my response was typically polite and Canadian. I wrote back and in a long email and told him about the title and where it came from, and I explained that the Book of Negroes was the name of a historic document that provided reams of biographical information about the 3,000 black loyalists who left New York City in 1783 at the end of the American Revolution, sailed to Nova Scotia to become the black loyalists of Nova Scotia, and that this document, the Book of Negroes, kept by the British Navy, featured prominently in the novel, and that indeed my protagonist had to have her name entered into it before she could come to Canada. So I had named the book thus in order to resurrect a document that sadly, in my opinion, was forgotten and that should be known by Canadians, and in a really fascinating ledger. And he had some demands that were, of course, unacceptable to me, like to recall the book and not to have it available anymore and to change the title and so forth. And so it just went to worse, and he just proceeded with his plans. He modified the actual burning, and he ended up burning copies of the cover of the book for television cameras rolling rather than the book itself. But I just want to come back for a second to 73 because it's such an interesting moment in our lives, and it fits into this. I was 16 in 1973, and I was sort of reaching out to get to know my family, especially the African American side of my family. I wasn't seeing a lot of black folks in Don Mills, Ontario in 1973 where I was living, and so I was trying to find people where I could and connect in my own ways. And so part of that meant maybe once a year or so I'd take a bus from Toronto down to DC and visit my paternal grandparents, May and Dan Hill. My grandfather was a theologian at Howard University, and my grandmother had been a social worker, both African Americans, and by this point, of course, both retired and living in this lovely suburban part of Northwest DC on Chain Bridge Road, where it turns out people originating from slavery and then freed had been living since the time of the end of the Civil War on Chain Bridge Road in DC, a black community. At any rate, I remember asking May, my grandmother, in 1973, because the word was so much up for grabs, well, May, how do you like to call yourself? Do you like the word Negro or colored, or do you like the word black, or how do you like to refer to yourself? And she said, no, I don't like those words. I am an Afro-American. And it was the first time I'd actually heard somebody use that term, Afro-American, and she was quite vehement that this is how she wanted to be known. And that same year, my father was promoted from being the director to being the chair of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And the Globe and Mail ran a headline, which was meant to be polite and respectful, which said, Negro appointed OHRC chair. And so here we were encountering the word, and on one hand, his mother is moving beyond the word Negro and beginning to reject it and wanted to claim something that she finds suits her self-concept better. And the Globe and Mail is attempting, to be
in a
polite.
well-intentioned way. Now, and
Yes.
Carol, how were you identified then by way of London, Antigua, Toronto? How did people make sense of your racial identity in 1973?
And this is from the perspective and reminiscences of a child. But I felt at the time as if I was stepping literally into another world. I remember being at Toronto Airport and feeling that everybody sounded as if they were on TV. That was the first thing that went through my mind. Everybody sounds like they're on television, because I was hearing Canadian accents, and I associated North American accents with the world and life of television, and not somehow with the real. But it became, very real immediately once you enter the school system and you're on the playground and you're in those public shared spaces, and other people start to name you in ways.
So how were they naming you then?
Well, I thought of myself certainly as Caribbean, as Antiguan. I knew I was born in England. I didn't have a memory of England at the time. And it was very much a kind of shifting sense of identity. Knowing that there were other kids who had similar kinds of backgrounds to myself and that I shared that with them. And some of these children who are Caribbean people who are not people of African descent, but we shared the Caribbean in terms of food, music,
Sure.
and other cultural reference points. But very powerfully, the United States, in terms of American popular culture, in terms certainly of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, once again, films, blaxploitation films, right? Early 1970s, this is the year of Foxy Brown and Coffee and all these great Pam Grier films, which I was far too young to see, but old enough to know that I was missing something, so to speak. So it was really a sense of shifting ground, shifting terrain, and I think the flexibility of childhood, and if you're well nurtured as a child, I think one of the gifts of that is being able to land on your feet and make sense in your own way
Right.
of what was going on.
So then if I could take your two sort of responses together, what this suggests, if we put it back in the context of the situation in the Netherlands, would be the kind of internal complexity and heterogeneity of racial identity, that it's filtered through history, through geography, in a lot of different ways. And now I'm trying to make sense of Grunberg's response in that email to you.
Well,
Finish it, done. I don't want this at all. And I'm wondering if you could each just say something about that as a reaction to an uncomfortable subject, a book that we don't like. We want it banned. Here are my demands. Get rid of this book. There's, of course, a rich, deep, complicated history around this. But what did you make of that as a reaction? If I could just sort of get each of your responses to that.
well, obviously, I don't believe in burning and banning books, but what really I didn't have any trouble coming to an understanding of why I should defend the book or why nobody should be burning or banning it. What I did have to struggle with and wanted to work around and come to understand was, rather than just having a completely negative knee-jerk reaction to Roy Grunberg and his decision, I wanted to understand what was motivating him to come to the place that he did. Why did he choose to do this? What is going on in his head, and what does he find so offensive? And so I began to dig a little bit more into the history of African peoples in the Netherlands, and how were sort of people of African heritage depicted in contemporary Dutch culture, now. Of course, we do have the slave heritage, and in many ways, like Canada, the Dutch generally didn't seem to be overtly happy talking about their own slave history and their own history as a slaving nation. And so that seemed to be a bit similar to Canada. But also, in contemporary culture, there were two issues that were just really so visible in Dutch society, and still are. One of them is that there's this chocolate, and anybody who's ever had breakfast in the Netherlands knows how much the Dutch like their sweets at breakfast and lunch too, for that matter. And of course, there's chocolate everywhere. And one of the most popular chocolates consumed, it seems, throughout the country was this chocolate that had been known. Unfortunately, the title was Negro Kisses. These are how these chocolates had been sold and packaged and known for decades. And Roy Grunberg, the same fellow who opposed my book and found such offense in it, had led a campaign, a successful campaign, to change the name of that chocolate so it no longer would be called and consumed as Negro Kisses in the Netherlands. And there were lots of incredibly vile visual stereotypes in terms of the marketing of those chocolates that went along with it. So he was inflamed by that issue.
And saw no meaningful difference then between the Book of Negroes and Negro Kisses.
Right, and frankly, if I'd been in the Netherlands when he was distributing a petition to have the name of that chocolate changed, I would have signed it myself. I found it, a vile name. And the other thing, of course, is this whole parade having to do with Sinterklaas in the Netherlands. And of course, one of the helpers of Sinterklaas is Black Peter, or Zwart Piet, who embodies every imaginable racial stereotype of a black person. He's dressed up as a buffoon and carrying on as a bit of a fool in Dutch culture. And so often these are white people who are dressed up in blackface now, every year in the Netherlands to celebrate the Sinterklaas celebration. So
Not simply in the Netherlands. It happens down at the Brickworks every Christmas. Fact. Has anyone else seen it? Black Peter? Yeah,
I've seen some protests about it in Canada. I've seen 1 or 2 protests where people were upset about this and were protesting against it in Canada. But so he's also responding to this, and so there are vivid, polarizing, disturbing images that permeate Dutch society.
So then the meaningful distinction would be that the term Negro is an active, politically charged term in Dutch contemporary cultural discourse
it is
in a way that it wouldn't have been for you writing this book. You're doing an act of historical reclamation.
It is a politically charged term. It's politically charged here too. I didn't use it lightly, and I didn't use it to offend either. I used it to resurrect a forgotten document. I don't walk around in my day-to-day speech using the word Negro. And I know there are people who deliberately sort of throw troublesome words out there to try to tame them or weaken their, diminish their sting, and I'm not one of them. I don't sort of play with language in that way in my day-to-day speech.
Right.
Now, I wasn't trying to make a political statement in naming the book. I just thought it was a perfect title for the
what
book,
it was.
given the subject.
Now, Carol, could you say a little bit historically, I guess, just about this reaction to something unacceptable, distressing, problematic? Burn the book, censor it, get rid of it.
Well, a couple of things. I thought the fact that the cover of the book was burned and that not the text itself, that perhaps the kind of exchange that you'd had with Roy Groenberg, that maybe the offense was in the naming of it in translation, and that the resonance of it in Dutch, given the experiences of Surinamese, perhaps, and this is a lot of speculation, but when I heard about the video and the fact that the cover itself and not the text, and that you'd gone into explanation, because I read your response that you published in the Toronto Star about that, and you also were very careful in that response to explain the historical context and the bringing to light of this particular story of liberation and freedom, which in many ways resonates deeply with the kind of work that Mr. Groenberg and the organization that he heads were about. It's sort of parallel historically here in Canada. So I thought that was quite significant. But the burning of books, the censoring of speech and ideas, I mean, there is such a long history of that, whether it's political or religious ideas. For myself working in religious studies, it's impossible really to think about any major world religious tradition in which the notion of heresy or heretical, and I put very large quotation marks around those particular terms, doesn't at some point figure in the history of that particular tradition. And so whether it's the destruction of a person, the destruction of an idea or text, that particular impulse has been there cross-culturally. I think what it means today, when I heard about this reaction to your book, I thought, my goodness, in some way it's signaling the significance and importance of the work if it can provoke such a profound reaction. But then when I heard further that the impulse was around naming, it made me think, is this just a knee-jerk reaction? Is this about translation of culture and language and resonance and where people might hear things differently? What I appreciated in your chapbook, Dear Sir, I Intend to Burn Your Book, which is directly out of Mr. Groenberg's email, the first lines, was the fact that you positioned yourself trying to understand that worldview or experience, and in fact noting that in many instances you probably would align politically with the kind of work that group was doing in the Netherlands, and in fact in a Canadian context have in terms of parallel situations. So I think looking at it or trying to understand what happens when individuals or organizations make that kind of move towards censorship in which the act is so quite violent and destructive and doesn't really leave space for debate or dialogue, that really troubles me quite a lot.
Yeah, and it troubled me very much too, Carol. And as you picked up the day that we met in Waterloo, and I told you that I just received that email, it was awful. Writers sometimes joke about how how great it would be if somebody tried to ban your book because suddenly you have all sorts of sales and attention that you weren't getting before. But the bottom line is that most people who are the subject of really hateful campaigns, they suffer. They suffer at the hands of their publishers. Publishers may very understandably be reticent to promote an author or a book who's going to draw a lot of contempt or hatred or create a terrible controversy and problems. Bookstores may pull away. I was very lucky to have a publisher that sort of stood behind me very vigorously in the Netherlands, but they could easily have said, well, that's enough of this guy. We won't publish any more of his books. Look at the trouble he created. Right. They did go on to publish more of my work in translation, but they could easily have backed away. So most writers, who are the subject of hateful campaigns like that do suffer. And it's a bit romantic to imagine that you're going to benefit from some sort of PR campaign as a result. So it was hard. It was hard to watch. It really sort of took me by surprise. I don't know if my email to him had any influence on what he did, but I'd like to follow up on your comment about the challenges of translation, and I think in some ways it's worth exploring a bit, Carol. And I think in translation the title perhaps becomes even more difficult than it is in, say, English Canada.
I wonder. I mean, I'm not a speaker of Dutch. It's not a language that I know, but I think about language in context. Going back to our 1973 parallel experiences, when you told me about the headline, for instance, announcing your father's appointment, I was kind of shocked that in a major paper like the Globe, in a respectful fashion, that the term Negro would be used. But I thought, you know what, it is 40 years ago. And in terms of the kind of history of race and racialized identities, that terminology, there were generations of Black people who grew up referring to themselves and feeling comfortable with that kind of reference point, and they had a different understanding of it, not as a put down or a point of degradation, but in terms of their own lived experience as a point of pride and identity.
Well, for sure, yes. My dad was born in 23, and so he would have been 50 at this point, and he still, commonly used the word Negro. That would have been his most typical reference point. It was still very much permeating common language, in Canada, even among, people of African descent, call themselves Negroes. Many still did in 73. It's fascinating, the sort of the kaleidoscopic evolution of racial terminology. And I've often argued that the reason that it's evolved so quickly and that we seem to always be unhappy with a term and are moving on to another is that it's deemed to fail. It's bound to fail no matter what it is, because you can't, it's an absurd process to begin with. You can't pretend to define a person racially, as it's a trumped up, invented category anyway, the concept of race or racial identity. And so to sort of force a name on it is necessarily going to upset somebody who a few years later is going to be looking for something better.
Can I jump in on that? Actually, it's one of the quotations from your most recent book that I found most engaging, and it was when you say, quote, "One must simply know the heft of each word," and I think in many ways that's really what you're now sort of unpacking for our audience, is a sense of the heft of these racially charged terms, whether used in sympathetic terms, proud self-identification, political terms, but when it comes to the heft of this word with respect then to censorship. And I'd like to kind of go back to that a little bit if I could. So, as Carol suggested, historically, censorship was an act of the powerful against the weak. We, in our religious positions, in our political positions, in our hierarchies, are able to silence the minority, silence the quiet, the weak, the subaltern, if you will. But in this case, what I find very interesting is that Roy Groenberg is not a big, powerful person. He's using censorship from, comparatively speaking, a minor spot. So I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit, did you ever have a sense? He doesn't have the platform you have. He's not here chatting with us. He's not flying around the world with his book being published all over the place, right? How could you, as an experiment, if nothing else, could you at all sympathize with his attempt to silence what was so painful for him in these kind of packed historical ways, given the heft of the word? Could you sympathize with his desire to burn your book?
Well, I think the whole point of the investigation that went into writing Dear Sir was to try to understand what brought him to the point that he wanted to burn it. Would I do it? Of course not. Do I support it? Absolutely not. I oppose it viscerally. Do I understand or maybe sympathize with regard to his psychological process and the way he's come to react to the word? Absolutely. And that's what I tried to juggle in the book. So yes, I have certain empathy for what was troubling him, but I don't agree with his means or what he chose to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's certainly understandable in terms of the power of words and the power of language to define, us in our situations. Being able to slip out of and into particular categories, that kind of experience, not many of us often have that, we might feel, we're not perhaps necessarily aware of how our own particular class positions or levels of education, for instance, allow that kind of transit between different categories. And I wondered about that. I mean, one of the brilliant things about your novel, of course, in many ways, it's about that particular journey of that character, Aminata, through her various life passages and travails. She resists that kind of characterization of dehumanization. So I felt it was rather ironic that for a novel to have the threat of burning, given what the focus of the novel was. And that's why I think maybe the book wasn't burned, but the cover was burned.
I'm not sure. I think I
don't know.
It could also just be matches and kindling and things, but
it was troublesome because I would have hoped that it would be a book that would have spoken to him as opposed to, although he didn't read it, he
refuses to.
He wasn't going to read it. But this brings us to the fact that other jurisdictions, have expressed difficulty with the Title II, and even in English, and it brings us back to Randy's point about the heft of language. The book did not go into the United States with its Canadian title, and over again, my experience has been that Canadians, for the most part, if they've learned anything about the Book of Negroes at all, even a sentence or two, have a basic idea what it's about, they seem to accept the title. Most Canadians that I've met of any background seem to accept that the title derives from a historical document, and are trying to bring light or attention to that document and resuscitate it in the public consciousness. But in the United States, there's, for the most part, been a viscerally intense response against that book, and even sometimes friends or family members who have the book in the States under the Canadian title are sort of afraid to be seen walking around in the subway in Brooklyn or something like that with the book, because they know how strongly people are going to respond to it.
So for our audience, as you'll recall, this was my first entry into the book was a CBC piece on the American titling of the book. So I'm wondering if you could just sort of explain to the audience
what happened there?
this kind of parallel situation with respect to the Book of Negroes naming life in the U.S.
Yeah, well, in Canada, my wonderful publisher, HarperCollins, brought it out, and then shortly thereafter, W.W. Norton in the States picked it up, and anybody who studied English Lit in high school or university will be familiar with the Norton anthologies. And so Norton picked it up in the States, and we had a long conversation with all of their senior staff around a table when they were pitching for the book and offering to buy it. And I asked them flat out, well, what about the title? Are you okay with the title? Oh, yes, we love the title. We understand it fully. It's just great. And they brought out their catalog to prepare to publish it. The catalog said the Book of Negroes. It had a really lovely cover that went with that title, its own American cover, and with its own art. And so we were set to go, I thought. And then I was on tour in Germany, and I got an email from my publisher in New York saying that they'd received so much resistance to the title in the American market, and that bookstores were refusing to stock the book or place advance orders, this is before printing, with the title planned as the Book of Negroes, that they decided to change the title because bookstores were refusing to order it. So it was going to be something else, and they gave me a title which I just couldn't stomach. And so I...
Larry's new novel.
So I had to just negotiate and finally come up with, in 48 hours a new title, which was Someone Knows My Name, for the American market. And over again in the following years, as I've toured in American cities, African Americans have come up to me at events and have said, all over the States, unsolicited, it's a good thing you changed that title, because I just hate that title, The Book of Negroes. I would never have bought your book or come out to listen to you tonight. I wouldn't be caught near that book if you called it The Book of Negroes down here. And the response has been just so viscerally, vehemently opposed to the Canadian title that I came to really understand this concept that the word that has a certain heft in Toronto isn't necessarily going to carry in the streets of Brooklyn, or Atlanta.
Or has a very different heft in an American context.
So, the level of pejorative kind of connotation in the States is infinitely greater than it is here.
Carol, I know that you have interest, for instance, in a scholar like Paul Gilroy and in sort of transnational diasporic Black experience. Do these sort of multiple experiences and reactions to Larry's work surprise you? What do they suggest to you in terms of how local situations inform the response to a work like this, or even a term like Negro?
They don't surprise me in terms of the idea that, different groups of Black folk in different cities, folk who, for that matter, are not people of African descent, are going to have different reactions. I think what's surprising, of course, is what the reaction is. You can't really predict necessarily. Living into the language and the identity categories and the ways in which people understand themselves and their circumstances, the subtle shifts and changes, that is something that I think is a part of African diasporic experience. Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic, was published 20 years ago in 1993, and the work makes a case for looking at the development of Black cultural experiences in Europe, Africa, and the Americas as being deeply connected, interconnected, transnational, and that it's impossible really to understand modernity without accounting for the arising of these particular cultures. But in doing so, what's interesting about Gilroy's thesis, and I think what's really applicable here, is the idea that Black cultural experiences in these contexts arise out of interaction and interchange with Western European, with Asian, with indigenous native languages, cultures, religious experiences. And so, of course, what it is to be Black, what it is to be a person of African descent, in these different geographical and cultural times and places is obviously going to impact how people understand that experience, their own experience, and how they understand it historically. So,
and then how they respond to a historical term like this.
To a historical text as well, and to the word. So I think that what's happened with your book in terms of the reaction and the titles, that comes out of that kind of differential experience of Blackness, different ways of understanding, and also of resonating and reacting. I know when the book first came out, I ran into you once again. This time it was in Uptown Waterloo, and it was around the time.
Rather than downtown Waterloo. We got to keep these things straight here, everybody.
It was on the street. And it was around the title change.
Yeah. Every time we bump into each other, there's drama.
There's drama. But I then recalled your saying after that time, in terms of the tours and the conversations that you'd had with people, that you came to understand that there were these different experiences in terms of the book. And I've gifted it to people in different countries, different places. And the reactions to the titles, to the title, it does vary. There are different, there's explanations involved, and it's like, okay, I get it, now. But,
did your Dutch publisher give any thought to changing the title? Did they draw attention to the candies?
Thank you for asking that. They sent me the cover, and the further away you are from home in terms of the publishing experience, the less likely you're going to be drawn into the preparation of the book. like the cover or the title and so forth. Sometimes they just show up in my door, like the Hebrew edition. You know, obviously nobody's showing me the Hebrew edition before it shows up. It just lands in my door, and there's six books in a box, and I have to call and find out, you know, how they translated it, like what exactly is the title in Hebrew. So
Oy Vey by Larry Hill.
Hopefully.
So it just sort of showed up in a mock cover just before they were ready to go, and I was a bit concerned about it. And I asked the editors, you know, in Amsterdam, well, what about this? Is it a bit too direct? You know, is it going to work in Dutch? I mean, I think it works in Canada. I think it works in English, in Canada at least. People kind of get it, and they can make the connection between the title and the document. Is that going to happen, you know, with a literal translation in the Netherlands? And they were insistent that it would be fine, and that it was a good title. And I asked the question, this word, you know, N-E-G-E-R, you know, does it mean nigger? No. Does it mean Negro? Yes. Is there going to be any perception that it's meaning something other than, you know, what you're intending? No, we're fine. And so I was a bit nervous about how the title would sound in the Dutch ear, but what do I know? I don't speak Dutch. And so I took their word for it, and we went forward. So we did have a conversation before publishing.
Now let's talk about the after then, if we could, just as it were, the afterlife of this book burning. Was it a oops? I mean, what did they say when they saw this happen? How did they respond?
The publisher?
To Groenberg's?
Oh no, they were. How did the publisher respond?
Yes, how did the publisher
No, they were
respond?
very supportive, and they were insistent that
Publicly
you know,
supportive in a sense?
Yes, very publicly supportive, and they stood by me every step of the way, and they refused to pull the book or change the title or all that kind of thing. They did all in terms of supporting the author and standing up for the book and the title. They did, in my view, all the right things. Now the book had already become a bestseller in the Netherlands before this incident happened, so it's not like it hadn't sort of made its mark, you know, in the market first, and that probably emboldened them a little bit. But they were very supportive, and they defended the book, you know, very strongly.
Where do you, whether it's in a cultural, historical, or religious context, where do you see, historically, from your research, where do you see the defense then of free speech emerging from minority communities?
I think the defense of free speech for minority communities often is in reaction to looking at the ways in which widely held beliefs at particular times really oppressed a lot of people. And seeing, for instance, how those particular beliefs in contemporary times would be condemned. I think there's a sense often that the ways in which people understand themselves in contemporary times is a direct reflection of the historical. And that we know that's not, you know, true, or that there obviously had to be, you know, differences, and we know that, and we could see some of the watershed moments and so on. But I think the importance often is that those viewpoints that run against the grain, go counter to what the broadly held particular beliefs are, that it's important to be able to hear what they, how they're expressed, what they're saying, what those particular ideas mean. Almost every year, I teach a second-year course at Laurier in the Religion and Culture department that's called Religion and Culture of the African Diaspora. And one of the books that we read in that course is Olaudah Equiano's narrative. And Olaudah was somebody who, like your Aminata character, survived the transatlantic slave trade as a child of 11 and had many experiences and bought him his freedom and wrote about it and published the book. One of the
became
reasons
very famous in
it
London.
made him very famous at the time, and there were doubts about whether he actually wrote the book. There have been doubts raised now in contemporary times about whether or not the book was somehow fictionalized, which I think would actually make him even more brilliant if it was, you know, a composite of experiences, for instance. Doesn't necessarily take away from the impact of the text. But I think one of the important, that's an example of writing an expression coming from the vantage point of people who do not hold the keys to power economically, culturally, or politically, and expressing, in fact, what at the time would seem to be a minority viewpoint, a viewpoint that runs against the grain. Now today when we read it, over 200 years later, and the other slave narratives as the genre of writing came to be known, many of us would say, aha, but of course, yes, that is, wrong, and yes, definitely, people deserve to be treated and, judged and assessed and loved on their merits and not by arbitrary categories of race and so on. And so to me, that's an example of the need for expressions that may run counter to be read, to be debated, to be talked about. And that certainly was a text that hit a nerve politically. It's one example, but I think it's directly related certainly to the aims of the novel, and related also, I think, thematically in terms of the notion of a journey.
And Olaudah Equiano becomes very well known in abolitionist circles in London when his book comes out. I think it was around 1789, right?
Yes.
I guess it was the first sort of internationally famous slave narrative. And it's so great to hear you talking about teaching these slave narratives. And I've often mentioned to high school students, if I'm visiting a school or something, how if they really want to understand African Canadian or African American literature, that they should go back to the slave narratives as sort of the foundation. And of course, I tried to write the Book of Negroes as a sort of a pseudo slave narrative and put Aminata in the position a bit that Olaudah Equiano might have been in, sort of a celebrity in London. And what would that look like, and what would that feel like to be a black person in London in the very late 1700s or the dawn of the 1800s? What would that look like, if you were celebrated and known to everybody? And so I tried to put Aminata in a similar kind of social position that he'd been in after the publication of his book.
If I could sort of to jump in on this, for me when I was listening, I was thinking about Frederick Douglass a lot. And I was thinking about, for me, when I teach Frederick Douglass, I find very strange that the prefaces from white New England elite abolitionists authorizing this man's telling of his own life story, right? Listen to us. We will give, based on our authority, this is authentic, which I've always struggled with beyond the kind of historical moment of it. There's nothing like this, of course, in the Book of Negroes. There's no need for that. But the book, in global terms and in specific political terms, has taken on a life of its own. And I'm wondering if you found it strange, the experience of, in some ways, having to become, in a way, almost a spokesman for your own book, an apologist for the effort you made, given the way that it has been politicized. I was wondering if you could speak to that, whether you did it directly in the Dutch context, whether there were Dutch reporters calling you, asking you for comment, or more generally.
Well, I've never really felt that I was an apologist for the book, because I never really felt I was ever apologizing for anything or asked to apologize. And when the Dutch media, for example, in this really tempestuous situation, did call it, it was never framed in a way that made me feel like
you had to defend
I was being asked to defend it. On the contrary, I wanted to take the threat in the business of burning the copy of the cover seriously and talk about the real issues. But I've never really felt that I had to apologize for
What were they asking you for? You had to with your dialogue, or your failed dialogue in some ways with
What were the
Groenberg.
Dutch media asking me for?
What were they curious about? Yeah.
Well, they wanted to understand what the book was, why I'd called it that.
So classic reporters, they hadn't read anything. They just wanted you to explain it to them.
Well, in fairness, if it's the reporters who were calling in the wake of the burning, they might not have read the book. But the reporters who interviewed me while I was on tour had really done their homework and had come to the literary critics and had come to the interviews having read the book very carefully and with very thoughtful questions. But nobody, who asked me serious questions in the Netherlands made me feel that I had to apologize, for the book. And they wanted to know about the title, what it derived from, how I came to understand it. They were very interested that, for the first time in my life, actually, it was in the Netherlands that I saw an actual slave ledger from an actual slaving ship, and I'd never seen an original copy of a slave ledger in a slaving ship until I went to this town called Middelburg in the Netherlands. In this Middelburg commercial company from 1730 to the end of slavery in the Netherlands, 1863, ran something like 119 slave ship journeys linking the Netherlands and Africa and Suriname, and sold thousands and thousands and thousands of African people into slavery in the Netherlands. So I looked at their logs in this museum in Middelburg, and I had a good friend, Connie Steenman, who came along, a Dutch person who translated for me so I could read. You know, she could sort of read over my shoulder and tell me what I was reading in Dutch. It was fascinating and really touching. And so often the Dutch media were interested in what I come to learn about the history of Dutch slavery, and were interested in the fact that both countries seem to have this history, but a history that was not openly discussed by most people in the country. So those are the sorts of questions that I was asked when the Dutch media contacted me. So I've never felt that I was put in the position of apologizing, for the book.
One last question, and then I think we'll perhaps turn to some audience questions. And it would be, did you ever hear from Grönberg again? Do you have any sense of whether this event became a pretext for him to develop a broader public profile in the Netherlands? Any sense of him, or is it really just that sharp exchange and then?
I don't know much about him. He was in the audience, I learned later, when I spoke to an audience of 100 or 200 people in the Dutch Surinamese community. He was there, but he didn't speak at the time. At least if he spoke, he didn't introduce himself or say anything critical or negative. And that was an overwhelmingly positive event. So I really don't know much about his background. I know that he led this campaign to change the name of that chocolate, a successful campaign.
And nothing since, as it were.
Pardon me?
And nothing since. It's not like he's.
No, so I can't really speculate about his personal motivations or where he's gone, but our contact was limited to those brief emails.
And then finally, Carol, for you on a scholarly level, looking, backstage we were chatting, you were speaking of sort of your interest in the kind of ordinary people's everyday higher order experiences. And so Larry just pointed out the challenge of speculating about why someone is doing something. So from your perspective as a sort of publicly engaged academic, how do you understand kind of real-time events of sort of public import, historical import? To what degree are you interested in getting into the inner life of a man like this, as opposed to sort of understanding him from various historical lenses?
I'm very interested. I think trying to, trying to get a sense of the kinds of experiences that he may have had. Did he grow up in Suriname? Did he grow up in the Netherlands? What were his schoolyard experiences like? Is Dutch his only or first language? What does it mean, therefore, to name yourself within that particular language? The other day, I was saying to Larry that it's interesting when we as people of African descent in the diaspora meet each other. We're often meeting each other in languages that have been adapted by our ancestors, which are our own language now, like English or French or Dutch or Spanish and so on. And those are the languages in which we have to name ourselves and express our experiences. When I think about Grönberg's experience, those are the questions I have. So for myself, as somebody who's a sociologist who's interested in culture, but also interested in analyses of power, I would want to ask those kinds of questions about that everyday life experience, and also his understanding of what the language means and what naming means. What is the power of naming? As children, of course, I can think back to my own 40 years ago experience. I did not relate to the term Negro at all. I mean, I knew it, I knew of it, but in terms of an internalized sense of identity, no. I think that has to do with coming from Antigua as a child. I think it also has to do generationally with being a child of the civil rights movement in terms of the time period, being born in the 1960s and so on. Those kinds of questions about our own temporality really matter here. It's uncomfortable, but I think once again, if we're talking about issues of censorship as well, It behooves us to go to those areas that we might find also quite uncomfortable or disdainful, or the ones that we already think that we have a particular kind of judgment or position on.
And grant the empathy that in some ways Grönberg in some ways denied Amanada, denied the novel in some ways. Thank you for raising those questions.